and welcome to episode 206 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Shane here in Denver, Colorado, and with me on the line from Chicago, Illinois, it's the one and only Godfather, Dave Harbarger. Dave, what are you drinking?
Just enjoying my coffee.
Okay, Dave, it's 8 p.m. Central Time.
No, I'm not. I'm having a matcha tea latte today. I'm trying something different. Got a different thing going on.
Matcha tea. Dave, you know that has caffeine as well, correct?
My spouse told me it does not have caffeine. Am I in trouble here?
I mean, okay, how many grams of matcha are you having in that cup?
I don't know. It's a grande Starbucks matcha tea latte.
Okay, well, the variance is high.
It's high variance caffeine?
Yeah, generally, matcha contains 9 to 44 milligrams of caffeine per gram. A typical serving of matcha is between 2 to 4 grams, which would then contain anywhere from 38 to 176 milligrams of caffeine. So, Dave, you could either be totally fine or be off your rocker.
Okay, so maybe people don't know, because this is the thing that you and I know about me, is that I'm very sensitive to caffeine.
Yeah. I mean, this is what you told me. I've not seen this in action.
You haven't ever seen this in action?
No, I've never seen you buzzing off the fiend.
Oh man, I sweat. I get really nippy with people.
More than usual?
Snippy, yeah, more than usual. I'll get really anxious. I might feel like I have like a sense of impending doom from caffeine.
More than usual?
More than usual. Yeah, it's all more than usual. It's like heightened to me. The caffeine really heightens the worst parts of me. But I still like it. I still need it to get out of bed, but I have to have the exact right amount of caffeine.
Well, I wish you luck on your journey with matcha tea. I'm
gonna stop that. I'm only gonna drink it if I need to clear my throat.
Yeah,
that's all.
For hydration. Yeah, I've got my 20-year-old Nalgene that's probably not safe to drink out of. It's got those BPAs.
Well, we hope you all have a beverage with us now and can enjoy something safe and that'll make you feel great. Did you ever see the Ken Burns Civil War documentary?
No, but I'm looking forward to you integrating it into this topic of conversation.
Well, it's just talking about caffeine. It always reminds me of there's one letter in that documentary where it's someone writing back about how much they want coffee and how addicted they all are to coffee.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like Josephine. It's like letters from the front. And it's like, Josephine, what I wouldn't do for one more cup of that hot, steaming, fresh Joe. It girds us and prepares us for, it's like a really dramatic letter about love for coffee that just really sticks out in my memory.
I need to watch more Ken Burns, I think. I don't know.
Maybe. I don't know.
I should watch the jazz one. I like jazz.
Sure. You like baseball too. Did you watch the 15 zillion part baseball one?
No, Dave. I have not watched. I seriously have watched no Ken Burns.
That's fine. You're fine. You're good.
He's like the pan zoom guy, right?
Yeah, he invented pan zoom.
Perfect. He invented it. Well, before we start our offshoot podcast, where we go through all the that's actually a pretty good idea for a podcast. We are going to talk this week about the NRG Championships that happened this past weekend over Saturday and Sunday. 16 players went into the gauntlet and one emerged victorious. We will talk about them in just a little bit. And Dave, you had the bright idea. I think it's a good idea to talk about our fears, talk about our doubts as we go through a little bit of a deck dive for Domain Zoo.
Yeah. I have to say, I feel the caffeine taking effect right now. I'm going to set the cup aside.
Do not.
I suddenly feel anxious and not happy.
Because we're talking about Domain Zoo?
Yes, exactly.
But before we get into this week's episode, a little bit of housekeeping. We have 2 new patrons this week. We've got RJ and Shinheng. Thanks so much for becoming citizens of the Dive Down Nation and giving us your support. We have no new reviews this week, but if you want to give us a shout out, tell us what you think, head on over to Apple Podcasts. You can also throw some stars at us on Spotify, either via desktop or mobile, one of the two. I keep forgetting which one. If you want to be like RJ and Shinheng, you can go to patreon.com/thedivedown, and as little as $1 a week gets you into the definitively discreet Dive Down Discord. Going up from there gets you various types of swag headed your way. You can also support us by wearing some of our swag, wearing some gear, wearing some t-shirts, some hats, some fanny packs, some hoodies, things like that over at our store, thedivedown.com/store.
Got a lot of those out in the world right now. I know some people are planning on going to, Philadelphia. Was that this
That's
week?
a thing.
Was SCG
There's
Con?
something there.
Yeah, recent. I don't know. There's events coming up. Get some swag. We haven't been paying attention to those as much, but yeah, we got great stuff there, and that is at thedivedown.com/store. Check it out. And if you would like to support us while playing Magic Online, you can check out ManaTraders, manatraders.com, our first sponsor, our first love. Great rental service. I rented the deck that I was using this week from there, rented the deck I was using last week from there. Use the code TheDiveDown10 to get 10% off your first 2 months of rental service. ManaTraders.com. Barrister and Man. You want to check out Barrister and Man, get some grooming products. We've been talking about them for a while. Use code TheDiveDown15 at barristerandman.com on your first order to get 15% off and let Will know that we sent you. And then finally, if you would like to get a discount while buying paper cards, you can go to Nerd Rage Gaming and use code DIVE8 to get 8% off of paper cards that you order from them. Just a little bonus you have for being a listener to the show. NerdRageGaming.com.
Because we are, in fact, the official podcast of the NRG series. And as such, we're going to head into the breakdown to talk about the championship that took place this past weekend. Again, it had a pretty interesting structure where the 16 players who qualified were broken into 2 pods as they performed through 4 stages of both Modern and Pioneer. The first stage was the largest. There were 7 rounds of Modern and Pioneer. The top 2 in each of the pods of 8 were automatically advanced into the third stage. Got to get to skip the second stage, which was 3 rounds of Pioneer. Actually, that's 3 rounds of Modern in Stage 2. Stage 3 was 3 rounds of Pioneer. If you won 2, you got to stay. And so by the finals of Stage 4, there were 4 players left, and they fought to the finish in best of 3 matches between Modern and Pioneer. So let's first...
Yes, it's a complicated but cool structure. Don't worry about it. I think it was good and fair for a structure of a tournament with 16 people who've already won things this year, giving them all a pretty good chance to get to the top.
That's a really important thing. And one of the things that all the players there, I saw a lot of tweets from people who were in the tournament. Everyone was saying it was just like kind of the most fun and satisfying and rewarding Magic that many of them had played in the year. They said they really enjoyed the event, and so it must have been run really well, and they must have liked the way it went down, even though it was slightly more complex as a viewer to really understand. But the most important thing is I think it gave people a lot of opportunity to keep playing and stay in the tournament and make their way to the finals. So another cool thing that everyone was really hyped on was that they gave all of the players like a framed Championship Series branded sort of like shadow box with 3 cards that the player had done well with over the past year.
Yeah, that was a really nice thing for sure.
Yeah, super nice. Really cool. And they gave us all of the deck lists from all 16 players. And again, they had to bring a Modern and a Pioneer deck.
Yeah, can we look at this by format instead of by player? I think it might be a little more interesting for people to do it that way. So let's take a look at the overall meta for the 2 formats first and just list them out. And then we can talk about who played what decks as we kind of look through the list. We're all familiar with these players now. We'll get through their names as we go through it. But let's start with Modern. Why not? It's our home, right? So Modern, here's what the overall breakdown for this 16-player invitational tournament was. 3 Breach decks. You are X Breach, and we'll explain why there's an X there this time. You can think about that for a moment. 3 Blue-White Control X decks. 2 Hammer decks. 2 Rakdos Scam decks. 2 4-color mid-range decks. 1 4-color Elementals deck. 1 Amulet Titan, 1 Living End, 1 Izzet Murktide. What do you think about that breakdown?
This is more or less what we expected, I suppose. I think there's, perhaps 1 fewer Hammer player, a little bit more blue-white control-based decks. I mean, also the 4-color mid-range decks, as we'll talk about a little bit, are one is more controlling than the other, I'd say. So there's a good amount of control here. But overall, I think this is what I would somewhat expect. Like, I think the players here were trying to select decks that, one, I think they thought they had raw power, but also decks that they could metagame against what their opponents are doing. And I think we'll talk about some of the interesting metagame choices in the deck construction as we go through the individual players lists. But yeah, I'm not too surprised here. I mean, maybe the fact that like there's only one Is It Murktide, but this doesn't seem like the kind of tournament that you bring Is It Murktide to, right? Because it's sort of like, hey, this deck just has a lot of general play, but it's not something you necessarily might pick to really force out other strategies necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Max Kamenowski, who's the person who brought Murktide to this, well-known player, Twinless Twin on Twitter, had a lot of success with it through the year. I'm pretty sure that his little vignette of cards was Murktide. I think this is where you go. You go with the deck that brought you.
Yeah, dance with who you brought. Is that how it goes? Dance, yeah.
You got to dance with who brought you. Yeah.
Yeah, do some dancing.
So why don't we start with Max's deck? Well, since we're talking about it already, a couple of interesting things about this deck, just to like check it off the list. Is it Murktide? Okay.
Yeah, this is a wild one.
2 Snapcaster Mages in this deck, not 4 Dragon's Rage Channelers at this point, trying to grind a little bit more. 1 Spell Snare and 1 Abrade main. This is someone who is keeping an eye out for serious 2-drops and also wanting a little extra artifact hate main.
Yeah, and we'll see that this kind of theme repeat. People who have main deck inclusions or sideboard inclusions that you would not normally see because of the small field and I think the expected metagame. Some cards I didn't not even know were modern legal.
Oh, okay. In Max's deck or just in general?
No, just in general. Some cards in other people's decks and sideboards.
Other interesting thing about this Murktide build is that back to a couple Archmage's Charms main, which is sort of come and go as far as different metagames go, but
yeah,
there you go. Archmage's Charm decided to give it a shot for this one. All right, other than that, since we just wanted to start with Murktide since we were already talking about it, but didn't factor into things too much as it turned out. Why don't we start with the top deck on the list, and that is Temur Breaches. And the reason that it had an X was because 2 players brought Temur Breach, Andrew Ellenbogen and Jesse Robkin, and then another player brought straight up Is It Breach, and that was who?
Yeah, Mac Andrus brought Jeskai Breach.
Okay, Jeskai Breach.
Yeah, so Andrew and Jesse, I believe they were saying on broadcast, were testing partners this weekend. They brought the identical modern decks and pioneer decks, and their Temur Breach deck was splashing for Renin 6, being able to pay for Haywire Might, and then also having some Veil of Summer in the sideboard. Those are the things that I noticed. Have you seen anything I don't?
No, I mean, that would just about cover it. It's Renin 6 really is the thing. And what it replaces in the deck, if you look at it versus Max deck, is Teferi, of course, is the card that it replaces. And then also, Mac was playing with Thassa's Oracle, and it looks like Jesse and Andrew decided to play not with Thassa's Oracle, but with Grapeshot instead as the kill card. One final difference is that Mac was running Ledger Shredder as a 3 of, and was also running Haywire Might as well. So had splashed some green to be able to pay for Haywire Might, and also had Ragavan, of course, to do it. But Ledger Shredder was present in this deck and not in the other 2 Breach decks.
Yeah, because I'm not like a deeply schooled Breach player, like it does seem like the Temur Breach deck seems much more all in on the combo aspect of the deck rather than have like sort of a beatdown backup plan, right? Like, I mean, what are you attacking with in the Temur version?
Well, I mean, one is just consistency, being able to grind, being able to hit X1s with Renin 6, of course, is one thing. Being able to grind, get lands, hit land drops as you want to, be able to pull cards out of your graveyard that you're getting there with Grinding Station. Another big thing is that you can threaten Renin 6 Ultimate here if you want to. So you have an alternate win con that isn't really as present in the Jeskai list, where the Jeskai list using Ledger Shredder is maybe a little more focused on being able to attack. This deck is a little less able to attack, but is more able to get you with Renin 6 plus a couple lightning bolts. The other thing I would notice is that Jesse and Andrew were running 2 Fable the Mirrorbreaker.
Yes.
Main as well, to be able to just for value, get extreme value, but also help fix their mana, get more mana, and even just have like 2 2/2s out of a single card, which can be good in a situation like this too.
For sure.
So these are cool decks. These are masters of this deck. Jessie in particular, everybody knows, is super well known for running Breach. So it's interesting to see her decide to audible over to Teamer here away from Jeskai, but I'm sure that they had good metagame reasons. Probably wanted to be able to grind is the big one.
Mm-hmm. I think this was going to be a grindy metagame, especially when we go to our next bucket of modern decks, and that's blue-white X control players. And we can start with the people we expected to bring.
Two of them, right? Right off the bat are two people we thought would have this deck.
Yeah. So Zach Allen is actually playing a blue-white deck, in quotes, splashing red and green for things like Ren and 6, for things like basically for Ren and 6. But Zach is running 2 Jason Mind Sculptor.
One other big thing that red and green doing this splash lets you do, which is he's playing Leyline Binding.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
as a full play set, which Joe Bernal, the next deck you're going to talk about, is not. And then also the final control list was also running Leyline Binding because it was banned. So
yeah. So let's talk about Zach's deck really briefly. We have 2 Jason Mind Sculptor, pretty classic there. It gets access to, of course, like you said, the full playset of Leyline Binding with this kind of absurd mana base that Modern offers. One thing that caught my eye was 3 Boseiju in the 75, 2 main, 1 side. To me, this indicates a pretty healthy fear of Hammer and perhaps Breach. There's 3 Endurance in the sideboard as well. It's pretty wild to me that we can support these types of mana requirements. With Endurance is 1 green, Archmage's Charm is triple blue, Counterspell double blue. There's just a lot of pretty tough requirements that I imagine Zach was able to hit reliably.
Yeah, I mean, Ren and 6 you really want to play on turn 2 if you have it. So that's wild.
Just a lot of interesting fetching, and I'm sure that Zach knows what he's doing there. But then, like you said, Joe Bernal's Azorius control list was very classic modern list.
Oh, and I was wrong. I glanced at his list a moment ago, and it didn't look like he was running Leyline Binding, but he was too. He was running 4 Prismatic Ending and 4 Leyline Binding, and so is Zach as well. So I missed that. I thought that they were only doing 1.
Yeah, he has a splash for the Triomes. He has a variety of Triomes in there. He has Rafine's Tower, Ketria Triome, and besides that, sort of has like a Jeskai-ish mana base with Hallowed Fountain and Steam Vents, but we're talking pretty classic Azorius control structure here. I mean, this is like 4 basic islands, 2 basic planes. Like, it's that kind of mana base.
Yeah, there is one super wild thing in here for me. Take a look at Joe's mana base.
Yeah.
Look at that last column of lands.
Yeah, I like this one, the Hall of Heliod's Generosity.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good way, I guess, just to recycle your Leyline Bindings?
Well, there's 2 cards. You can recycle Leyline Binding. You can also recycle Shark Typhoon, which is
Dress Down.
Or Dress Down as well. So there's 3 cards, really. So it looks kind of wild when you first look at it, but especially when you are pretty sure that Shark Typhoon and Dress Down are going to end up in your graveyard. Of course they are, because they have natural ways to get there, whether it's via cycling or the sacrifice trigger.
Yeah.
That's a pretty interesting little piece of tech to be able to bring in there.
I think it's kind of brilliant. Like, you're expecting maybe a grindier metagame where you're going to have time to potentially reuse something from Hall of Heliod's Generosity. And it's the kind of thing that you're not necessarily going to do when you're really stretching your mana base, like for Ren and 6 and Endurance and so on. But in this simpler mana requirements, that's something I think he could pull off.
Yeah. Wild times. All right, let's talk about the last control deck.
That's Raja Suleiman on a Bant control list, another person we expected to be on some kind of control. And what Raja was splashing green for here was Broker's Charm, noted modern staple of Broker's Charm, Endurance, of course, and Veil of Summer.
I will say, I believe we've seen Raja run Broker's Charm in a control list in the past at these NRG tournaments, in some of the earlier kind of actual tournaments themselves.
I mean, it has value. I mean, it destroys target enchantment, draws 2 cards. It seems like people are really teching for longer games here. Or, it can do something with the pile of creatures that this deck has. I mean, when it has a value with Solitude, Subtlety, if you actually really need to use it. But Broker's Charm, I saw people in the Twitch chat saying things like, Broker's Charm has looked pretty decent every time I've seen it be cast. And I mean, I would hope that you get some kind of value out of your 3 mana charm.
Interesting. These blue-white control decks, it's a pretty stable shell when you look at the spells that are here.
Yeah.
Especially when it's like Counterspell, 4 Prismatic Ending, 4 Leyline Binding, 4 Solitudes, 4 Teferi Time Ravel, I think, in all of these as well. Well, not 4, but some number of those. So it's interesting to see how they're like slightly changed.
Yeah, I mean, the card that I actually wanted to point out in Raj's deck too, that also uses the green mana, and that I didn't really know was modern legal, was Ray of Revelation. It's a 1 and a white destroy target enchantment, flashback for green. That's it. So really respecting enchantment removal here.
Yeah, it's basically Ancient Grudge, right? Like it's the enchantment version of Ancient Grudge.
Oh, right on, yeah.
Okay, well, what's next on the list?
We've got 2 Hammer players. We've got Will Kruger.
No.
Yeah, well, I mean, surprise, right? His was a Bant Hammer list. The only reason for splashing green that I could notice was to pay for Haywire Might's ability. Otherwise, it's a very typical Azorius Hammer looking list. And then also Theo Young was on a Azorius Hammer. It looked pretty stock.
Yeah, I mean, I think Will is kind of the standard setter for Hammer, right? I think like in the Moto community and here at NRG, he's kind of been that person. And yeah, this list looks very close to the thing that he has in a guide that he recently put up for people to buy. The one thing that's a little bit of a surprise here is there's no Blacksmith skill main deck in this build. There's an extra Spell Pierce, so there's 3 Spell Pierce and no Blacksmith skill. So post-board, if you want that extra protection, you can only get access to 2 of them because that's what's in the sideboard with an extra Spell Pierce. So that's the one surprise I guess I would have. But other than that, yeah, it's pretty close.
Up next, we had 2 Rakdos Scam players. We had Connor Mullally and Piper Powell. I believe they must have tested together as well because they had identical lists for both Modern and Pioneer.
Yeah, I was looking at that too, and I don't remember anything circulating about that on Twitter. Like I didn't see anybody mention that on Twitter like I did about Andrew and Jesse, but it seems like we have to assume that.
Yeah, highly likely. And this list is pretty stock. They've got 2 Blood Moon, 3 Fable the Mirror Breaker, 6 Undying Malice and Feigned Death effects, plus 2 Malakir Rebirth the Flip Land. But otherwise than that, it looks like scam.
Yeah. I do think 8 Undying effects is a little high. It's usually 7.
Yeah, it is.
I feel like. And a lot of the lists that we've seen online recently have rotated away from Malakir Rebirth and are running like 3 Undying Malice and 4 Feigned Death or the opposite. So it is interesting to see them go for 1 extra one. This is a pretty streamlined looking version of Scam when you start to look at it that way, where it's kind of like you got your 8 elementals, you got 4 lightning bolts, 4 Thoughtseize, 8 Undying effects, Ragavan, Dalthy Voidwalker, and then basically 6 Pyromancer effects because you have 3 Seasoned Pyromancer and 3 Fables, and then your kind of wild cards are Blood Moon, 2 Blood Moon, and Kroxa.
Yeah, deck looks good to me.
So this was a deck that I saw people talking about a little bit on Twitter. Like Zach Gallen kind of said that he got destroyed by this deck because he wasn't expecting anybody to bring Scam. I think this might have been the deck that nobody thought from like the high-end metagame of Modern that most people thought wouldn't show up at this tournament, and then it turned out 2 people brought it.
Yeah, a bit of a curveball. I don't think Scam had been... I don't remember any of these players kind of bringing something like Scam to the table in the past, and so maybe it was something where like, hey, we can get a bit of a surprise factor. We have a lot of hand disruption and board disruption, so maybe we can make something happen here. And then also because the mana bases are fairly aggressive in many of these decks, maybe they were like, hey, these 4 and 5 color players, we can maybe catch out with our Blood Moons. We had 2 players on what are in the 2 color mid-range bucket, but the decks are pretty different in my opinion. We had Nicole Dubin on a 4 color sort of Omnath, pretty stock looking, if you can call a deck like this stock, where they have the elementals like Solitude, Fury, Endurance, Omnath. She had a few Eladamri's Call, Ephemerate, and Lightning Bolts all showing up a bit in the main deck. I did notice that she put an old school like Surgical Extraction in the side, not something you see a ton of, maybe just hedging against some graveyard.
Call Stan.
I'm calling Stan.
Let him know.
Stan.
Someone's playing Surgical.
Nicole had Surgical Extraction in her sideboard. And then we also had Ivan Espinoza on a 4 color Omnath build, but this looks much more of a controlling build than Nicole's list. It has things like Jace and March of Otherworldly Light, Supreme Verdict as a one of, things like that.
Chalice of the Void.
Yeah, Chalice.
2 Chalice of the Void main.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a much bigger version of that shell.
So, and then we have into our one-ofs, we have a 4 color Elementals deck that
Derek Davis.
Yep, Derek Davis brought. It looks like elementals. It has, from the 4 Flamekin Harbinger on down, it's 4 color elementals. Then we have, let's see, we have a Max, as mentioned, on the Is It Murktide list. We have Zoe Reederman on Living End. That looked like Living End to me. And
Living End Master.
Yeah,
Zoe.
just like dance with who you brought,
the deck that brought you,
et cetera. Adam Washburn Moses on Amulet Titan, pretty normal looking main deck. Cultivator Colossus, some interesting sideboard options, however, like an Emrakul the Promise End and Hydroid Krasis making an appearance. We've seen some Hydroid Krasi in the past. Adam decided to bring it back again. I think a lot of people expected games to go longer here, or have the opportunity to have games to go long, so having some good sideboard options for those type of environments I think is pretty smart. There's our modern metagame.
What do you think?
I think it's great.
Again, we talked about it off the top, but what do you think about these individual decks?
I think there's a lot of smart construction here, right? I think these are not stock lists. I think people put a lot of testing time in. I think they put a lot of thought into what the metagame would look like. They wanted to have put their sideboard tuned for that, and main deck tuned for that metagame. These are not like open metagame deck lists, right? Like these, if you have things like Ray of Revelation in your sideboard, if you have 3 Boseijus in your 75 as like a blue-white X control deck, you're predicting something special and trying to prepare for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting here is these people know each other very well for the most part, or lots of them do, and there's lots of relationships in here among the people that are in this 16-person field, right? And I saw, for example, someone shared, I don't remember who it was, someone shared a spreadsheet and said, well, here's what we thought everybody was going to bring to this tournament. And they had highlighted what they had gotten right and what they had gotten wrong. And they were like, I was pretty close to knowing what people were going to bring down to the player. And so I think, like you said, people could really sit down and it's almost like a knowable thing, right? So you could sit down and try to figure out, okay, I'm going to try to level it and try some things, whether it's with deck choice or sideboarding. I do think that from the Twitter Whisper network, it looked like Scam was the leveling deck. I don't remember how those 2 players fared completely, but I do know that it was a surprise to see that for people out in the Swiss during Modern, at least. And then the other decks, I think, are kind of decks that we mostly expected people to have and some specific players to have, but all of them, like you said, had tech in the sideboard or in the main to account for the meta. What's your favorite little piece of tech that you saw here?
Ooh, I mean, it's not the Spell Snare, even though the Spell Snare is perfect in a metagame like this. I mean, a lot of people were splashing green to pay for Haywire Might, and I think that's smart. I mean, I don't know if this is like normal tech in things like Hammer and such, but I think Haywire Might was definitely a card we're seeing make pretty frequent appearances. And maybe Broker's Charm. I mean, I'm not like a control player aficionado by any means. I don't know if I'd call it tech, but like I just really respect the number of players who were like, hey, this is going to be a grindy, controlling metagame. How do I tune my main deck selections to like allow me to get advantage in that environment?
Yeah, I think mine is probably Jesse and Andrew going for Ren and 6 in Breach, which is a variation that's known but hasn't seen a ton of play a lot of places, and so to bring that back here because they felt like it was a good fit for this meta, I think it's cool.
Yeah, so I think we have a lot more to say about these modern decks than we do the Pioneer decks. Probably think because, one, we know the modern decks a lot better.
Oh, well, we'll see about that. I'll be the judge of that.
Perfect. So let's talk about our overall Pioneer metagame. We have 4 mono-white humans, 3 Azorius Control, 2 Green Devotion, 2 Lotus Field, 2 Rakdos Midrange, 1 Gruul Vehicles, 1 Selesnya Angels, and 1 Enigmatic Fires.
Interesting.
So fairly close to our original thoughts, I think. There's actually a little bit more skewed towards people making what I think is probably the correct choice in a lot of ways, which is, let's play the deck that's got the numbers and we can tune for the metagame, things like mono-white humans.
Yeah, I mean, I think mono-white humans is the big surprise to me. I didn't think that many players would bring an aggro, what is an aggro deck to this field, especially with these players, right? Because there's always a little bit of a reputation that good players maybe have better tools against aggro lists, or better that are able to understand exactly what they need to do in order to survive an aggro matchup. But, I saw Andrew Ellenbogen on Twitter today, or right after the tournament, say, I guess it's time for us to let you in on a little secret, which is that we really think that White Humans is the best deck in Pioneer.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's been bubbling for a while, but nobody's really said it.
Which is wild. I mean, like, these are not secrets. We are not like tea leaf readers. We are not like digital archaeologists. We are just, when we talk about mono white humans, like 55% win rate, like we're just reading numbers off of websites. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like a lot of people could come to these same conclusions and just be like, hey, this is clearly one of the top decks in the room, if not the top deck.
Yeah. So why don't we start with that? What did these lists look like?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, they looked like mono white humans lists. So let's the players that were on it were Nicole Dubin, mono white humans, Andrew Ellenbogen,
Jesse
Robkin, of course. And who was our final player? Adam Washburn Moses.
That's right.
So I can't really speak a lot to these lists that, like, I don't really know what the big differences are. The things that I do notice let's go to Andrew and Jesse's list because they played the same list. They kind of have an interesting split between like 2 Skyclave Apparition, 2 Brutal Cathar for their sort of like 3-drop interactive drops. They have
Extraction Specialist as a one-of.
Extraction Specialist, as a one-of. Of course, and I don't know if these are always included in these lists, but some cards I saw do work were things like Castle Ardenvale and Aganjo, Seat of the Empire. Castle Ardenvale was definitely a card that for these grindy matchups, I definitely saw do a lot of work for Jessie in the games that I saw her play on camera. There's Wedding Announcement in the sideboard. There's 4 of Wedding Announcement. Definitely another grindy card. It does a lot of value long term.
Yeah, I think the only difference I can tell between Jesse's list, for example, and Adam Washburn Moses' list is he has 4 Brutal Cathar and a Skyclave Apparition, and she has 2 Skyclave Apparition, 2 Brutal Cathar, and 1 Extraction Specialist, but then also has 2 Brutal Cathar on the sideboard. So it's like what O-ring creature do you want to play? And then having a little bit of value with the Extraction Specialist move is, to get some grind a little bit out of your deck, but I think that's pretty much it. And then looking at Nicole's list is a little different. Couple of main deck Tomics, main deck Kithian, main deck Thalia Heretic Cathar. So a couple more pieces of tech in here that maybe weren't in the other players' lists.
There's a lot less interaction in this list. There's 4 Adeline instead of like the Brutal Cathar and like the Skyclave Apparition. There's only a singleton one of those. So I think that Nicole is looking to perhaps beat down a little bit more strongly, and also with the main deck Tomic kind of do a little bit of, so what's the main advantage? You can't play land cards from graveyards, and lands on the battlefield can't be targets of Spare's ability or opponent's control. So this is a hedge against Lotus.
Yeah.
In the main.
That's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, because you can't target it with your the copying
hidden
land.
strings. Yeah. Or
any of your spells. Yeah, it basically just shuts down Lotus Field. So Nicole must have been expecting a little bit more than was out there in the field.
So there you go. All right, what was next on the list? Azorius Control.
Azorius Control. Weird. The players that brought Azorius Control variants to Modern also brought it mostly to Pioneer. We have Zach Allen on Azorius Control. We have Joe Bernal on Azorius Control. We have Derek Davis on Azorius Control.
What we do not have, though, is Raja Sulaiman on Azorius Control, which I thought was almost a lock for Pioneer here, but we'll get to that later.
For sure. I don't have much to say about these lists. They look like what I would expect Azorius Control and Pioneer to look like. There's some interesting newer cards that because I haven't been paying attention to this deck very much. Like Zach Allen's running 4 Lay Down Arms, a card out of Brothers War. It's a single white sorcery. It exiles target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of planes you control. Its controller gains 3 life. So there's just oodles of planes in the Hollowed Fountains, the Irrigated Farmlands, the Prairie Streams, the basic planes. So you can take down any number of creatures for a single white mana if this deck gets going for a while.
Yeah, and then one of the other big differences is that Joe Bernal's list is a Yorion list. So it's 80 card, and it has kind of what you would expect for 80 cards, but that's what it is. But yeah, these are just control piles. They're the things that you would expect to see in Pioneer, the best blue-white control cards in slightly different configurations from each other.
Yeah, I mean, Joe got to play, 4 Shark Typhoons in both of his decks this weekend. So just, play the cards you love and just work with them. Get some Dovin's Veto, get some Arch of Otherworldly Light, have some fun. And Derek Davis's list, I mean, I don't know what to say. He's doing the 4 lay down arms tack, has some counter spells, some removal, some things like that, but it's not a Yorian build. So kind of focusing on winning with, Wandering Emperor, Teferi 5, things like that.
Yep. All right, what's next on the list again?
2 green devotion lists. I know that Zoe Riederman was one of the people on that, and the other was Theo Young. And I don't have much to say about these lists.
Nope, they just look like mono green to me. Not to dismiss anybody's work that they put into testing, but...
Yeah, and then we have Connor Mullally and Piper Paul. As I said, they look like testing partners because they have identical 75s for their Lotus Field decks. I don't know Lotus Field well enough, and these decks seem that they change a lot. Lotus Field's like last 6-7 cards I noticed change quite a bit when I look at deck lists. One thing I do notice is they're going for more Hope Tenders. Like I've seen Hope Tender, which is a card back from Hour of Devastation, and it's a 1 and a green 2/2 human druid. You can pay 1 and tap it to untap target land, or you can pay 1, tap it, and exert it to untap 2 target lands. If you forget, exert means it doesn't untap during your next untap step. So they have 3 main and an additional 1 in the sideboard. I've seen typically 1 or 2 in lists in the main deck on when I've been looking at MTG Goldfish. That's kind of one small change I've noticed, but they're also running like 4 Emergent Ultimatum. I think I typically see something like 3. They have a main deck Languish, which is not always there. So some small tweaks, and the Languish is probably awesome against mono white humans.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
I mean, is the big thing here that Hope Tender plus Hidden Strings lets you untap even more lands? Is that kind of what the vibe is?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just a nice untapper. I don't know if it's the best untapper, but it must be if people are running it. I mean, untapping 2 target lands is big game. Like if you have a Thespian Stage copying a Lotus Field or something like that. So,
well, also if you can then Hidden Strings, untap Hope Tender, exert Hope Tender again, because there's nothing to stop you from exerting it a second time in a single turn. Like you can get a ton of mana going on pretty fast.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, because Hidden Strings doesn't target just lands; it's untap or tap target permanent. So sounds good to me.
All right, we're out of our depth here with Lotus Field, but
yeah, we tried valiantly. And then we go to 2 Rakdos midrange decks, and our players on that, I know Raja Suleiman was one player on Rakdos midrange. Who was our other, Dave? Did you see it on the list? Oh, Max Kamenowski.
Yep.
Anything
Let's talk about Raja's
here?
List first, because that was the last match of the tournament, was Raja on Rakdos versus Jesse Robkin on Mono White Humans. No spoilers, but not to spoil too much. We'll get to it. But Raja's Rakdos list, pretty kind of normal, what you would expect. It's got 4 Bloodtithe Harvester, 2 Kroxa, 2 Misery Shadow, 4 Bonecrusher Giant, 3 Graveyard Trespasser, 3 Sheoldred the Apocalypse, 4 Fable the Mirrorbreaker, 4 Fatal Push, 4 Thoughtseize. One-ofs are Doomblade, Go for the Throat, and Liliana of the Veil.
Miser's copy, just kind of covering my bases here with a Doomblade, Go for the Throat, and Liliana.
Yep, and then 2 Dreadbore in the main as well to close it out.
Yeah.
Looks like Rakdos midrange.
It looks great. I mean, this is a very safe mana base too. You can do stuff like that when you have like Fable and so on, but like I think it's 28 lands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, just 26. 25 lands. So
26
I think
is a lot for a mid-range deck.
Yeah,
though.
I mean, it's definitely safe. You have the 4 creature lands, 2 Hive, 2 Den of the Bugbear. You have your Castle Lochthwain. You have a lot of ways to use your mana over time. Takanuma is another card that you can channel to get something back out of your graveyard. So I think this is, it's a very safe, good list, and I cannot believe when I saw Raja playing this on camera, like how well he played this deck, and we'll talk more about that, I think, as we go forward, but just so much value generated out of these cards.
Yeah, I mean, the big difference in the deck that Max Kamenowski brought was that Max had 3 3 Reckoner Bankbuster main with 1 in the sideboard as well, which is a card that's been showing up in this list for a while, but I don't think I've ever seen a full play set in the 75 before. I could be wrong about that. All the Misery Shadow were in the side. Extinction Event was in the side. All of that stuff was over there. Not as much Kroxa, not as much removal, a lot of Power Word Kill instead of all the other one-ofs.
Not respecting Selesnya Angels.
Yeah, that's interesting. Really puts you in a bind if someone has Angels, and there was one person that did.
The thing that, so Reckoner Bankbuster. Dave, let's talk about this card briefly because I literally don't know what it does. It's a 4/4 vehicle for 2. It ETBs with 3 charge counters on it. You can pay 2 and tap it to remove a charge counter to draw a card. If there are no charge counters on it, you create a treasure token and a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater and its crew 3. So yeah, basically it draws you cards, and then if you don't have a creature to crew it, it gives you a 1/1 that can crew Reckoner Bankbuster. So again, this is like just a grindy card.
Yeah, the other thing is that it upgrades cards that can be somewhat average in the late game, like Blood Tithe Harvester. You can crew with your Blood Tithe Harvester if you want to turn it into a 4/4 instead, if you don't want to draw a card for some reason. But yeah, it's mostly value, draw some cards, and occasionally crew it up with something like Graveyard Trespasser or Blood Tithe Harvester, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, gutsy pick, I think, but cool. So then we have our one-ofs of Gruul Vehicles, Selesnya Angels, and Enigmatic Fires. We had Will Kruger on Gruul Vehicles. We had Dave, who was on Selesnya Angels. Oh, it's Ivan Espinoza.
Yep.
And then Enigmatic
Defending
Fires.
champion, Ivan.
Yeah. And then who was on Enigmatic Fires? Mac Endress. Cool.
Well, wow, I really don't have a lot to say about these decks.
No. Nope. Me either.
I do really like the Gruul Vehicles decks. It's probably something that I would look into if I was looking to buy a bunch of rares for Pioneer right now.
Yeah, right.
You got to get the Essicus Chariot and get the Sky Sovereign. This deck was shown to be decent. At least it was at the top range of the brackets that we talked about last week from Frank Carson's article, but not as not as mainstream and didn't do that great this weekend either.
Yeah. All right. So that actually took longer than I anticipated to talk about all these decks. So let's talk about the results of the actual tournament. So NRG, because of the unique structure of the tournament, they actually didn't give a lot of super deep data about wins and losses and things like that. I'm looking forward for them to publish that hopefully in the next day or so. So I kind of pieced this together by watching the broadcast, looking at the VODs and things like that. So stage 1 again was a 7-round sort of modern and pioneer intro round where the top 2 people from each group of 8 were moved on straight to stage 3. In Pod A, we had Connor Mullally and Max Kamenowski take top seats.
Yeah, just a reminder, Max was on Murktide and Rakdos Mid. Those are the decks that Max advanced with.
Connor was on Scam and Lotus Field, and they went straight to stage 3. Adam, Washburn Moses, and Derek Davis were eliminated from Pod A, and then advancing on were Nicole Dubin, Ivan Espinoza, Zach Allen, and Zoe Riederman. Pod B, we had Raja Suleiman and Jesse Robkin advanced straight to stage 3. I know that they each got 5 wins in stage 1, so they went 5-2.
And just a reminder, Raja was the Bant Control player and on Rakdos Mid. Jesse was on Teamer Breach and Mono White Humans.
And then eliminated were Joseph Banal on his Azorius Control duo and Mac Endress, who we said was on Enigmatic Fires and what, Dave?
Enigmatic Fires, and I believe...
Was it the Elementals players?
Yeah, was the Jeskai Breach player.
Jeskai Breach. And then advancing out of that into stage 2 were Andrew Ellenbogen, Theo Young, Piper Powell, and Will Kruger. So stage 2 was 3 rounds of Modern. You have to win 2 to stay in. Theo Young, Piper Powell, Will Kruger, and Zach Allen all failed to win 2, which means that Zoe Riederman, Ivan Espinoza, Andrew Ellenbogen, and Nicole Dubin advance out of stage 2 to make stage 3. They join Connor Mullally, Jesse Robkin, Raja Suleiman, and Max Kamenowski to form the stage 3 pod.
Yeah, essentially this is the top 8.
Yeah,
right?
This is the top 8.
This is the top 8.
They have to win 2 rounds of Pioneer now to stay in. And Andrew, Raja, Jesse, and Zoe survive to go into the top 4. And the finals, or stage 4, were best of 3 matches. It alternated format choice by the players. It begins with Jesse versus Andrew on a mono white humans mirror. Jesse wins the first match, and then they switch to the Teamer Breach mirror, and Jesse then wins that as well.
I mean, clearly the team, like 2 people that had it really go their way with both of their deck choices making it into the top 4.
Yes.
Essentially, it's kind of too bad that they met each other in the semis, but it is what it is.
Yeah. And then, meanwhile, Zoe faced Raja. Zoe lost the first match. We didn't see the format played on stream. Then she wins the second match with Mono Green Devotion over Rakdos, and then loses in 3 games in the Living End versus Bant Control Modern match. So our finals are Jesse versus Raja. They begin with Raja on Bant Control versus Jesse on Teamer Breach. She loses the first match there. Match 2, they decide to repeat the modern matchup. Jesse prevails. Match 3, I believe, is forced to be Pioneer based on the rules, and that's for all the marbles. Jesse wins game 1 of the Pioneer finals off the back of some nice utility lands, especially Castle Ardenvale to finish off Raja. Game 2 is a wild one. It's super grindy. Raja's able to stabilize using cards like Shieldred. The Graveyard Trespassers become Graveyard Gluttons. And then unfortunately for me, I did not see game 3 of this one. I had to do family stuff, and so I had to turn off the stream, and then I was working today. I didn't have the day off, so I don't know what happened there, but I do know that Raja Suleiman takes it all down. By all accounts, playing some super lights out Magic. I know Jesse was really effusive about the quality of play from Raja, and said that he deserved to win.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of awesome. These are all players that we watched the whole year. This top 4 is all players that we talked about multiple different times. And, many of these people who made it all the way through the day were. And so it's great to see someone who I think one of the first times I remember talking about Raja was one of the first NRG events that we covered at the beginning of 2022, and noticing that he was someone who is in kind of in the same orbit or similar orbits to Zach Allen. So cool to see someone from that community kind of take it all down. Wish it had been someone who's in our Discord. Jesse is someone who is sometimes around the Dive Down Nation, but not this time, I guess. But we'll see. Still a great year for her too.
Just an amazing achievement by all these players. I think these players put in so much work to get to where they are. You definitely could tell that they did so much testing and so much preparation for this event. And the Magic that was being played was super high quality. The stream was high quality. Everything was really good, and I really was happy that the year of NRG, when they went really big, I think had a really good tournament to end everything. Next year, the events will continue. We'll have fewer to talk about. That I think just lets us focus more strongly on them, and lets players make the trips more special events. I think more people can kind of travel from out of town to make those as well. So I wouldn't be surprised to see NRG have fewer but larger events in 2023.
That would be cool. All right, Shane, thanks for putting this together for us. Sorry we turned it into an hour of content, but
how'd we do it?
It was cool to go through the decks. Interesting stuff.
Yeah. So Dave, let's get out of here. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back to talk about Domain Zoo.
Yeah, we're going to do a dive down as fast as this deck is supposed to be.
So stay with us.
Shane, you know what it's never too early for?
Dave, what is it never too early for?
It's never too early to get ready for spring and get ready for that fresh fit, that fresh beard fit, that fresh beard scent.
Yeah.
And luckily we have some new release schedules here from our partners at Bear Sir Man.
We totally do. So I'm looking at the spring release schedule, and I'm seeing some things that are piquing my interest. One of the first ones, Dave, is the Passiflora bath soap. I really like Passiflora shaving soap, so I'm hyped to have this in like a bar soap, a bath soap. I know that, and Paganini's Violin is also coming out in a bath soap as well. So I know that you and Stan are both soapmen as well. So we have some new soaps coming out. I can use my now 7 soap dishes as the soap dish collection grows to have all them in front of me.
Amazing.
That's not true, but I'd like it to be true. There's a new release coming out as well, it looks like, or maybe this could be a re-release, and it's Marilyn, which looks like it's a tribute to Marilyn Monroe. And the scents sound dope, which is kind of some classic male scents, typically. Amber, bergamot, leather, fur, tobacco, sand. This is everything.
Fur?
Yeah.
Fur?
Fur. This is coming out in the shaving soap, aftershave splash, aftershave balm, and eau de toilette. So going all in on this one. I'm assuming this is a fan favorite. And these are all coming out February 7th. And then in March 14th, intended to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Barrister and Man. Congratulations on 10 years.
That is my significant other's birthday.
Ooh, so you can buy her some Rhapsody. That actually sounds pretty awesome. This is coming out in shaving soap, aftershave splash, aftershave balm. Not really going to work for her, but the bath soap and eau de toilette, I imagine, would. This is a fruity flavor: pear, apple, cherry blossoms, lemon, orange flower, rose. Man, that sounds really good. I like the ones that are kind of like a little bit like funky fruity. So yeah, so keep your eyes peeled on the Barrister and Man releases coming out both in February and in March. And if you want to purchase any of these, use code TheDiveDown15 for 15% off your first order at Barrister and Man. I did notice, Dave, for someone who actually used this code, someone on our YouTube, Jared K, said, I bought from Barrister and Man, love the Leviathan smell and Taiga smell, got the Taiga bar soap, will definitely buy again. See, people like this stuff. It's not just us.
Yeah, not just us. All right. Thank you so much for your support, and thank Will and the folks at Barrister and Man for supporting the Dive Down. We appreciate you. All right, Shane. So we thought after what could potentially have been a long tournament breakdown, which actually did turn into a long tournament breakdown, we thought maybe we would do a little bit of a aperitif or a little bit of a dessert with a short modern dive down this week on a deck that we think is cool, but maybe not the most complicated thing in the world, but still pretty interesting. So the last couple of weeks, particularly last week when we were looking at modern results, we noticed that most of the top 10 of the meta was pretty stable, with one exception. And Shane, do you remember what that deck was that was a new entrant into the top 10 most played decks in Modern?
Yeah, it had eclipsed even popular things like Amulet Titan and Yawgmoth, and it was Domain Zoo, I believe, was 9th place in December.
Domain Zoo, 9th place. So we thought, Stan took a look at this deck a few months ago. It's gotten a little bit of a renaissance since episode, I think 192 was the one where Stan took a look at it. So it was 2 or 3 months ago, maybe 194.
Time flies.
Yeah, well, that's only 2 or 3 months ago, right after Dominaria came out. We thought it'd be good for us to take a look at it. Stan didn't really like it when he played it. We thought maybe it would be good for Shane and Dave to take a look at it and see what we think about this build.
And this is a deck that we both have played variations of in the past. And we'll get into a little bit more about, kind of how that fits into the history of Modern a little bit, I think.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about Domain, what's in it, where it came from, talk about if we think it's a good deck, why we think it might be hanging around a little bit right now, and if we think it's worth giving it a shot, if you should give it a shot after his. So maybe it's a little bit of a sleeve belief heave. Even though we've got one of those coming up soon. So let's talk about Domain. Why are we domaining?
Why are we domaining, Dave?
What's Domain?
Okay. It basically just gives you rewards based off of how many different types of lands you have in play. So, plains, island, swamp, mountain, forest.
Yeah.
Not waste, right? Does waste count?
Waste does not count.
Why not? Oh, why not?
I don't think it does.
Oh, maybe it does.
Are you going to make this hard for me?
This is rules we should know, Dave.
Oh, boy. Okay, you Google that while we're talking. I mean, I think the thing about Domain is that surprised me as I did a little bit of research into this, was that it's had a renaissance suddenly in the last couple of years, but it's a super classic Magic ability, right? Like, it was an invasion. That was where it came from. Like many things that I think people love about this era of Magic, like our era of Magic design, is that people have looked at invasion for some inspiration.
Breaking news. Waste does not have a land type, so it does not count.
Got it. It just says land. Perfect. Good to know. We'll file that away. So, but it has had a bit of a renaissance, in particular in Dominaria United. There was a lot of stuff inspired by Invasion Block in that set, but also Modern Horizons 2 had a bunch of cards that had Domain on them somewhat inexplicably. And so the thing that was interesting to me when I took a look at this, for something, like I said, that kind of looms large in my memory, is that there's only 57 cards that have Domain as an ability word on them. which is not much across the history of Magic, especially for something that I think everybody just kind of gets as a design concept. There's not that many. Now, there are a few cards, I assume, that don't have the actual worded ability onto them. Like there's a card in Crimson Vow that I don't think says domain, but basically behaves like it's domain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But still 60, not a lot in 30 years of Magic for something that people really like.
Surprisingly few.
And so the best cards, though, I think people know very well, and they really do reward you in mana cost efficiency for getting to that domain of 5, or sometimes even make it worth 4. And what are those things? Like, what are the cards that, at least as far as this deck goes, are really being reliant on domain? Well, there's 2 things in this deck. There's 2 types of cards in this deck. Am I right, Shane? It's 2 cards. There's interaction and there's creatures, and that is it.
It's a perfect aggressive creature deck.
Yep. Lands, creatures, interaction, that's it. It's worth noting that the list that I played, which was a 3-run from a prelim by Odorous Urungus, who is a Magic Online player whose name I've definitely seen before, there's no black cards in this deck. I know that occasionally there's some black sideboard cards in these builds. This one was only 4-color domain, realistically, although, of course, you still want swamps to show up. So let's start with the creatures. And by starting with creatures, we're going to start with stuff that is decidedly not domain.
Definitely not domain.
And we'll look at it by mana curve, because there's only 3 mana curve spots in this deck for creatures. There's 1-drops, 2-drops, and occasionally 3-drops, though I didn't play any, and we'll talk about those not very much. But the 1-drops, what 1-drops do you think are in a 5-color domain deck, Shane?
Well, I know Wild Nacattl's in it.
Yeah.
Kind of the necessary evil card.
Uh-huh.
The one that does surprise me, and I kind of want to get into this, is Ragavan.
Yeah.
I mean, is this a card you just play if you have creatures and interaction, and you're just like, hey, if I ever connect with this card, I'm really happy?
Yep, pretty much. I mean, the fact that the treasure tokens can help mana fix you is great, and of course that they can help ramp you is huge in a deck where you could potentially go turn 2, drop a 2-drop, like turn 1, play Ragavan. If it survives, turn 2, drop a 2-drop, get an extra treasure with Ragavan, and then drop 2 more powerful 2-drops on turn 3. That can be pretty good. So I think that Ragavan fits in pretty well. I found the card advantage in this deck to be keenly needed. So it's Ragavan.
I mean, the thing that I think was helpful for me when I was able to play Ragavan and keep it on the board was the mana fixing. Because as we'll get into, like, I think the mana of this deck is a little bumpy, and you're not always able to fetch exactly how you want, to sequence stuff in the way that you want, or have access to the colors that you want, or keep up like a color that you want while also playing to the board. And so treasure tokens just help a lot with that.
Yeah. I think they help with it. I will say, for me, I think it was more about the ramp and just having extra interaction available. Like, okay, I'm going to attack, and now I have a treasure token, and because of that, because I played Territorial Kavu, and I get a treasure token, and because that's a 5/5, I have Stubborn Denial up. You know, like that kind of thing was pretty big. So anyway, there's that card, and then also, like Shane said, Wild Nacatl. Wild Nacatl, you know, it's a 1/1 for green that gets +1/+1 if you control plains, and +1/+1 if you control a mountain.
Yeah. What I didn't love about Wild Nacatl was just like some of the times the way that it makes you want to fetch, or the way it makes you want to sequence certain things is not great, where it's like, okay, like I have a green source turn 1 and I can play my Wild Nacatl, and then like, do I really care about getting the plains and mountain going for kind of like having it be more powerful turn 2, or do I kind of fetch in a way that lets me play a 2-drop? It's just sort of like there because you want to have 8 1-drops, I think. But like, you know, this card is just a removal magnet, which is fine because, you know, sometimes you want your more larger cards and not get killed, but you know, it's Wild Nacatl. It's been outclassed by things in Modern for quite some time, so
yeah. Let's come back to these. I think the story of 1-drops in this deck is really complicated when it comes down to it, even though these cards are not that complicated. And Wild Nacatl, like you said, outpaced, Ragavan, format staple. I think that this deck might ask you to play them in a way that we're not totally used to. And that is part of the trickiness of piloting this deck well, I think. But the real power of this deck is the 2-drops. And the 2-drops are all about domain. They're all about domain.
Yes.
And the best one, I think, out of this set is Territorial Kavu. Territorial Kavu is red and a green. For a Kavu, its stats are star, and its domain is that their Kavu's power and toughness are each equal to the number of basic land types among lands you control.
Yes.
So whenever Territorial Kavu attacks, you choose one. Either you discard a card if you do draw a card, or you exile up to one target card from a graveyard. This is a big threat. You want to play it as a 5/5. It doesn't have trample, but it does have rummage on attack, which is actually super useful.
Oh, yeah. The lack of trample is, I think, quite bad.
Yeah.
It really does seem like this card should have trample. We'll talk about an enabler for that a little bit later. I really did like the rummage ability for sure, because like you do not want to have too much land in this deck, because once you hit your colors and you have a certain density of mana, then you're good to go. So like, throwing away a land or an unnecessary piece of interaction to try to draw into perhaps more creatures or draw into burn to give you reach, I think are really clutch here.
Yeah, and that's why I think this is the best of these cards, even though and it's also the most resilient against removal facing it, right? Like it's or blockers for that matter. This is the one that it's a 5/5. It can get through an opposing Crashing Footfalls token, or it can block and make it hard for your opponent to attack in with rhinos. There's other situations too, but I think that the rummage ability and the ability to draw you into more gas when paired with Ragavan kinda is the reason that this is the best, most important one, the one that you don't want to have die, I think. Let's go to the next card. Neshoba Brawler. So this is a generic and a green. It's a cat warrior from Dominaria. It's got trample, and its domain is its power is equal to the number of basic lands. It is a star 3 card.
Yeah.
I remember during spoilers, we talked about this card for like a second and thought, well, maybe it's a 2-drop. It could be a big, powerful thing on turn 2.
Card's fine. The trample is clutch. The trample is super huge here. It's also easy to cast. That's like a big thing for me, is like you only need a single green source and then anything else from like your mess of weird lands and color that you have. And so like it really does open you up for a little bit more flexibility, where it's like, okay, a green and a black, and then I keep up my blue for Stubborn Denial, or I keep up like my red for a Tribal Flames or a Lightning Bolt, depending on the amount of mana I have available. So I think that's really the thing I like about it, is the flexibility on the mana and the trample for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this card, because of the lack of the rummage ability, ideally your Kavu. So when I was playing these cards, I would play this one before Kavu to try to get someone to kill this first, right? Mm-hmm. And then I would try to get Kavu online to be able to draw into more gas in that way.
Oh, yeah.
I think the trample's important. You're forcing in damage, yada, yada, yada. But this card, I think, is just kind of fine. And I kind of feel that way about the next card, too, which is Cyanodraco, which costs 12, of course. But its domain is that this spell costs 2 generic less for each basic land type among lands you control. It has flying. It's a 4/4, and then it says each creature you control has vigilance if it's white, hexproof if it's blue, lifeless if it's black, first strike if it's red, and trample if it's green. Those are the only 2 that matter, unless you steal somebody else's cards with Ragavan.
I mean, giving Territorial Kavu trample is great.
And first strike.
I mean, these are clutch things.
You know what's really good to give first strike to sometimes, though?
Ragavan?
Ragavan.
Yes.
That's pretty helpful occasionally.
For sure. I mean, you make your Ragavan into a Thalia, sort of.
Yeah. But this is the card that to me was always like, this is the one where if your mana gets disrupted, it's kind of the worst. It's hard. You never have any outs to cast it. This is the one where the flying helps a ton. So having some evasion to help close out games is nice occasionally, but it also dies to artifact removal randomly, which is kind of a drag here and there. I don't know, but the one thing is clear to me is that this deck is all about the 2-drops, and it's all about getting these 2-drops that you have to do some work to enable online as fast as possible. And so we'll talk about that more a little bit later when we get to the lands. But they're really good. They're really good stats to mana value ratio. They don't really do much. They just sort of attack. And
yes,
that's what this deck is about. It's about attacking. But given the past of this deck, the last time I played a domain deck like this with Tribal Flames in it was probably 2018, early 2019.
Sure.
And that deck at that time had Curdape, Loam Lion, and Wild Nacatl in it. So all of your cards were dependent on being weird cards that got stats bonuses for having a forest in play or having a mountain in play or whatever. And then we had Goyf in that deck as well.
This is that deck that a few people built because it was dirt cheap, besides like Goyfs, and then and except now you have better mana bases to support more domain creatures, and you have things like Leyline Binding and Scion of Draco and Territorial Kavu to take advantage of that. So this is something that they were pushing in Horizons 2, and they see as we got Leyline Binding, of course, after that, this is the result of that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the result of that and the result of a couple of other things. A couple other cards that people play in these decks, but we didn't. At least I don't. Did you run the same deck list as me, or did you try something different? You play the same as me?
Yeah, same deck. Just thought we'd talk about the same one.
There is a Cascade version of this deck floating around that some people seem to have a lot of affinity for, where you say cast a Bloodbraid Elf and go into a General Ferrous Rockerick, or you go into a Mantis Rider. Those are good cards too, Sometimes they play Geist of St. Traft to be able to have a really resilient threat that can kind of help you close out the game with a 4 in the air swing. These are all cards that are from maybe other eras of Modern in some sense, other than General Ferrous Rockerick, which is a Modern Horizons 2 card that sort of never had its day. But we just kept it really simple. This is the aggro version of this list. This is just the beatdown version of this list that we're talking about today.
For sure. It's interesting, in my playtesting, I did go up against some kind of weird Ferrous Rockerick style deck, but they never really seemed like to get what they were coming together. But let's talk about, Dave, the other pile of cards in this deck, which is the interaction. And
these are good.
Yeah, these are good, right? This is kind of like the payoff for doing the domain thing and, having a really somewhat junky mana base, but you get to play things like Tribal Flames and Leyline Binding. We've talked a lot about how much we appreciate Leyline Binding, how much it can do for you, the fact that it can just tag any kind of permanent for as cheap as a single white mana is kind of bonkers. And all it asks you to do in this deck is to do what you want to do anyway, which is play a bunch of different land types.
Yeah. I mean, Leyline Binding, if you're enabling it, is just the best Swords to Plowshares ever. Occasionally someone kills your Leyline Binding and they get their permanent back, but
I never had that happen. That's what's surprising. No one ever
barely
tags
ever
Leyline
happens.
Binding.
Yeah, barely ever happens. We just don't have decks. Just don't often have the tools to kill an enchantment. They just don't that much.
Yeah,
Haywire might change this a little bit, but
sure.
Anyway,
hey, we do in this deck too. But
yeah, and then the other card that's huge here. Leyline Binding is also important because it gets you out of stuff that the rest of your interaction can't handle, which is basically burn-based interaction. So you have Tribal Flames in this deck. And Tribal Flames is kind of an unbelievable card in the sense that it's 2 mana, sure, but when you have Domain, it's 5 to any target for 2 mana, and that includes players.
Yeah, it's outrageous.
So being able to kill a giant creature or kill a planeswalker pretty easily, or just double Tribal Flame somebody when they're sitting at 10 life and really don't see it coming is pretty unbelievable. Yeah,
Tribal Flames to me is like the card in this deck that makes it like a legitimate sort of aggro big creature deck. Like the reach is just pretty wild. Like it reminds me of stuff like Crater's Claws when I was playing like Khan's red-green aggro, where it's like, hey, if you're ferocious, if you have a creature that's 4+ power, it's just kind of like a really good fireball. And this is much better than that, of course, because it just does, you can't power it more than 5, but doing 5 for 2 mana is pretty outrageous. And it really can bring reach that people aren't really expecting. Like if they know this deck, like they're going to be thinking about Tribal Flames. But a lot of times if you're just sort of playing fast and loose, and people aren't expecting you to, deal 5 to the dome or deal 5 to their creature.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it's one of the original Domain cards. It's one of the ones that was also in the deck when I played it 5 years ago. I think it's a card that people have liked having access to for a long time. It's just a really iconic card, and it's cool that it's here as well. And then outside of that, so these are the ones that are really taking advantage of Domain and the ones that really give you that mana value. And then you have Lightning Bolt. So you actually have an 8-card burn package in this deck. in a lot of ways. And sometimes when I was playing this deck, it really felt like, oh, all I'm trying to do is tag somebody twice with Kavu, tag somebody twice with one of my 2-drops, and then I'm just going to burn them out. Like that seemed like what the primary game plan was a lot of the time. What do you think about that, Shane?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking game plan, like it takes you back to sort of like classic strategies like this, which is just I stick a creature or two, I remove the things that are in my way, or I trample over them, and then I can finish you off with a bit of reach.
Yep. Yeah.
More or less what I'm trying to do.
It's not more complicated than that, right? But, part of me was kind of like, is this a better version of burn? But I think, it doesn't go as fast as burn at all, and it's not as concentrated because you are hedging against certain kinds of interaction with your spells.
You're not getting under things with this deck typically. I mean, unless it's super slow, but you're not sneaking in 8 points of creature burn and then finishing off with a pile of 3 damage spells. You're sort of, you'd like to get in your burn, you'd like to get in your creatures through the interaction you have in hand. And if you're doing that with burn, you're not really super happy.
Right. Yeah, you'd rather be going to the dome. Though you're extremely happy if you just can suddenly not interact anymore and just go face with your spells.
Oh, yeah, I'm fine with that. Definitely finish people off with that, like a lightning bolt and a tribal flames for 3 mana doing 8 damage.
Yeah. Oh, I had a game where I was like, I had 3 cards in hand and I was like, okay, how can I get through all those blockers so I can keep attacking? The 3 cards I had were, I had a Leyline Binding and 2 tribal flames, and I had 5 mana. And I was like, okay, well, they're at 12.
Oh, they're just dead.
I'm just going to Leyline Bind in their blocker, hit them with Ragavan, and then I'm going to hit them for 10 with Tribal Flames post-combat. It was
perfect.
Bam. And then the final card in here for interaction, and this is a little bit of a wild card, I think, in this deck, but it's a card that used to be really good in Modern and then hasn't been as good for a while, and that is Stubborn Denial.
Yeah, interesting inclusion. This deck ran 4. Which I think is pretty aggressive in terms of what they're expecting to see, because it only hits non-creature spells.
Yeah, but here's why: you got to get rid of Blood Moons. You cannot get Blood Moons in this deck, and so if people try to go at you when on curve, maybe before you have a ferocious threat online to make it just a counter, just a negate, then you need Stubborn Denial for that. But also there's a lot of times where you can just force spike a Blood Moon or a Red and 6 and it's fine.
Yeah, I did a lot of force spiking. You know what I mean? Where it's just like, hey, this looks like a deck that's trying to do some spell stuff early. I'm not going to, playing to the board is a good idea here, but I think that I need to leave up some Stubborn Denial because I have it in hand, and that proved to be valuable. Where it's just sort of trying to, keeping your opponent off of casting spells, whether it's going to be a Spell Pierce or a Stubborn Denial, pretty valuable. And then once you do set up a board and have access to just a single blue mana, having just a counter spell, more or less, is pretty ridiculous. So, whatever, a negate? I don't know, some kind of counter spell type thing.
Yeah. Negate. Yeah. I don't know. It's a cool thing to look at this list and be like, oh, this is 3 really good 1 mana spells. Right, yep. That are trying to do a little bit of the Death Shadow thing, where it's we're going to have the cheapest interaction possible, a really threatening late game spell in Tribal Flames, and then a really weird utility spell in this build in Dramoka's Command as a 3 of in the build that we were playing.
Aggressive.
Part of the reason I wanted to play this build was because I was like, Dramoka's Command, sign me up. I remembered how much I lost to that card during the Abzan standard era.
Useful card for sure. I mean, what are the modes? It's +1/+1 fight. It's target opponent sacrifices an enchantment. It's make a red burns, make a direct damage spell not do damage, and then is there another one?
No, those are the 4 modes.
Okay, well, I think I only said 3, didn't I?
No, you said so. The +1/+1 and the fight are separate.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay.
Right. So it's 4 modes. And generally what you're doing a lot of times is against creature decks, you're making one of your creatures bigger and then fighting. And that's cool. And then you want to have access to Dramoka's Command to make someone sacrifice a Blood Moon, or in my case, a Spreading Seas that I faced at one point in time with this. So it's that kind of stuff that you want to protect yourself from. And then finally, I actually found that the Dramoka's Command was pretty good in the burn matchup, because I could negate essentially one of their burn spells and then also fight one of their creatures. So I would wait for them to try to Searing Blaze my person, and then I would go back and fight their Goblin Guide or something while the Burning Blazes on the stack, or Searing Blazes on the stack. So cool card. It was fun to play it again. I don't know if it's like the best, but it certainly made some sense in this deck. And that's the deck, except for lands.
Yeah. Let's talk about the lands a little bit. Like,
lands is the hardest part of the deck.
It's super hard. Like, I think it might be hard because it's not good. But like, it's kind of like what you have to do. Like, you're not going to really run more than this deck runs 21 lands. It's not going to really run more than that. Like, your only ability to sort of filter your deck is through Territorial Kavu. There could be something to be said for maybe like additional ways to do that, but that would require like Fable, the stuff that's just on a game plan, right? Like Fable, a Mirror Breaker, or Seasoned Pyromancer. And so what this is it has 12 fetches in Flooded Strand, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Foothills. It has 2 triomes in Zagath Triome, and which is the Sultai, black, green, or blue, or Savai, which is red, white, or black. So interesting that the overlap color is like your least useful one in black, but it also, I think, helps because you don't have a lot of your shocks that have black. So that gets you to your black pip in one of your triomes.
Right. So let me explain what's going on here, or at least what I think is going on here. Okay, this whole game plan is about getting to play one of your domain creatures fully powered up on turn 2. That's what I think that what we're doing is. Because I think that if you do it on turn 3, it's kind of too late, right? Or it's too slow. I guess that's plan A. You don't have to do it every time. It depends on matchup, blah, 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 blah. But I think what you're trying to do when you sit down and play is I want to get all 5 colors in play by turn 2 so that I can play Draco or Brawler or Territorial Kavu and hopefully play another one the next turn. In order to do that, you have to have a plan, right? Because the only way to enable that is through 1 Triome and 1 Shockland.
Yeah, but then if you a Triome turn 1, you're not casting a 1-drop.
That's the other problem. But so that's why the deck is constructed the way it is, and it's why the black pip is the one that's shared between those triomes, is because what you really want specifically is you want access to red and green on turn 2, so that you can cast either Brawler, Kavu, or Sign of Draco, all of them on that turn. And there's nothing that really benefits you from doing otherwise, right? And so either you want to land that casts Lightning Bolt or Leyline Binding, or you want a land that casts Stubborn Denial on the other side. Now, that might change with your game plan depending on what your hand looks like, but I think that's what it is. So the pairs that you have in this deck are, your play should be basically like, I'm going to go get Savai Triome, and then I'm going to cast Breeding Pool, but then I'm going to play Breeding Pool on turn 2, or I'm going to go get Zagath Triome on turn 1, and I'm going to play Sacred Foundry on turn 2. Like that's how you get to your powered up state. So I think that mostly what you're going to try to do is Zagath Triome into Sacred Foundry so that you can have binding, so you can have Bolt or Leyline Binding up early is the outcome in either case, really.
Yeah.
So either if you need the interaction, you can cast one of your 1-drops, like you can cast Wild Nacatl and still have those removal spells up on turn 2, or you play one of your turn 2 cards. However, what you said about the 1-drops is really, really hard here because it feels like you're supposed to play Wild Nacatl or Ragavan on turn 1.
Yeah.
And I think that the big brain thing with this deck might be that you're not. That you shouldn't cast those cards on turn 1.
Because like you sort of like give up the tempo turn 1 and just like get it all back later, where it's like you're in fully powered up mode.
Well, I think what you really want to do is go turn 2 Kavu, turn 3 Scion, cast Wild Nacatl or Ragavan on the side.
Sure.
Or, dash Ragavan on turn 3.
Yeah, I mean, definitely dash some Ragavans for sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. Like, I think that you can sort of piece together, like, depending on your lands, like, there's 12 fetches in here. So, like, you could pretty easily just do a fetch shock your way to 5 colors, because this is not a deck that necessarily needs an early Leyline Binding. So you can sort of like fit in a Leyline Binding later in the game, where it's like, okay, now I'm casting my turn 1 Leyline Bindings, or I have my fully powered up Tribal Flames, or things like that. So like, or you, like you said, you get that Territorial Kavu down on turn 2. Turn 3, you can fetch into like your 5th color, make it a 5/5. I think there's a lot of ways to play it depending on your hand construction and kind of the sequence of turns you need to do. You need to sort of take over the game.
Right, but not if you're trying to get domain by turn 2. Like,
No.
that's the one thing that you have to remember is, like, if you have a hand where you're going to play Steam Vents as your first land to play Ragavan on turn 1, there's no Triumph in this deck that gets you to domain on turn 2.
There's not.
There's nothing you can fetch up to turn that on. There's not even, and it's just not constructed that way. The earlier versions of this deck from this fall had Xander's Lounge and Indatha Triumph, which is the Abzan one. I don't know why those ones were chosen this particular time, but it's worth noting that black is the one that unifies those two as well. But the old deck was go Steam Vents and then Indatha Triumph, which I think makes it a little bit too late to get white mana. And then the other one is go Temple Garden and Xander's Lounge, which I guess is where like you go if you have Wild Nacatl instead. So there's different ways to do these pairs, but I think that there's all, like, if you look at the Triumphs, you should work back to which shockland you're supposed to be trying to get early on as much as possible.
Yeah, like this is not uncommon. This is something that we do a lot in 4 or 5 color rhinos, right? But the real problem, I mean, the benefit of that is that we don't really need a lot of turn 1 plays, right? Like, we're sort of taking over like turn 2, turn 3. And so you can pretty easily look at the shock that you have in hand or the fetches that you have available and be like, okay, I'm going to fetch up the Triome that matches with this, just like you said. But the problem with this deck for me is, and maybe it's like you said, is like, hey, you can take turn 1 off because of the benefit you get from your turn 2 plays and later on. So like, you know, rather than worry about get the 1 drop that messes up your entire land sequencing, is get the 2 drop that takes advantage of that land sequencing, and then you could double spell on turn 3, for example, like you said.
Yeah. That's just what it felt like after I played this a little bit, is like I was doing a little bit more freelancing where I was kind of like, oh, I'm going to play my 1 drop. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to be aggro this time. And it just felt like maybe a lot of times I should have just stuck to the plan and be like, okay, I'm going to keep my interaction up. If they don't have something I have to interact with, I'm going to go get my Triumph. Then I'm going to play my Shockland. Then I'm going to play my 2 drop, blah, 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 blah. And kind of game proceeds from there.
Sure. I mean, I definitely can't say I know the best way to play this deck. I just know a way to play this deck.
Yeah. So I think bottom line, we said this was going to be a short dive down, and so we're gonna cut it off pretty quickly here. But that's what this deck is, though. It's good assertive threats. It's good cheap interaction. Comes with awkward land sequencing and land development. Depending on how you play your cards, there's some serious choices you have to make that can make it feel like your game is not progressing. But what does that all add up to? I think it's sort of an interesting meta choice right now. I can't really put my finger on the reason that it has a little resurgence right now. Part of me feels like it might have something to do with Murktide, in the sense that even though Murktide is a Blood Moon deck, which is one of the worst cards to face as domain, when you're playing big threats and Ragavan, and you're playing Leyline Binding main in an assertive deck, it feels like you might be trying to exploit the fact that you can sort of catch Murktide off guard if you can kill their Murktide's main in a way that's easy, right? So I don't know if that's why or what it's really shooting for. Another thing could be that a deck like this, you know, it's not super duper. I guess it's as harmed by scam as any deck really is, especially since this is full of creatures. So I think
it has bigger bodies, like more toughness. So like the Furies don't immediately kill off everything. Like it kind of just would be a 2-for-1 potentially, where it's, unless you're getting the Undying effect, but it doesn't seem like an amazing matchup by any means.
Yeah.
You have a lot of redundancy. It's like a single grief, or like a Thoughtseize or something that doesn't really hurt your hand too badly typically.
Yeah. I do think against other creature strategies, like if you're playing against tribal decks, like this deck just felt like a pretty strong tribe in itself, where it's like, well, I have enough removal to just kill everything, and I have giant threats, and I can outpace you even though I'm dealing with your creatures at the same time. That felt like a pretty reasonable matchup when I was playing this. Hammer felt tough, for example, but I think that makes sense because we're trying to play cheap big threats, but their cheap big threat is bigger, and we don't have as many things that interact with that particular axis as we main board as we do maybe post board, where you can bring in like Wear Tear and a couple other things that might help you there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, overall, like I think like the deck has strengths in that it does what it wants to do fairly effectively and pretty routinely, because of the sort of like internal redundancy of the creatures and the amount of burn-based interaction and things like that. But I wasn't like immediately convinced that, oh man, this is the deck that I need to be playing in Modern. That's like kind of like the meta breaker.
Yeah, no, I definitely wasn't convinced of that either, for sure. But it did feel like it hung in there. It just felt so linear that there wasn't a lot of decisions to be made other than fetching correctly.
Yeah, that's kind of the big thing, is like, what do I do with my mana that allows me to play the game in the way that I need to in this current, board state and my hand state and what my opponent's trying to do, or I think my opponent's trying to do.
Yeah. I will say, if you are someone who already has some of these cards, this is not a hard deck to get into.
No.
In paper, the most expensive cards in this deck, believe it or not. Now, I mean, everybody knows Ragavan's expensive still. I'm looking at Goldfish. I don't know what the real cost is, but Ragavan is a third of the cost of this deck just in its own.
Yeah.
The other expensive cards here are the Khan's Fetch Lands. At this point, Wooded Foothills is a $45-ish card right now. Not 45, 30, yeah, $40 card.
Yeah. All the
Flooded
people who
Strand
sat on those for 7 years or however many years it is now.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know. I think this is a good deck if I'm just like, I'm going to relax and just like play some leagues, but just like be a little brainless about it. It's probably fun. It's fun. I had fun playing it, but I don't know if I need to go back either.
Takes me back to like, my red-green stompy type days where it's just like, here's some creatures, here's some spells. Let's see what happens on the other side here.
Yeah. So that's Domain Zoo.
Sleeve,
believe, or heave, Shane. I think believe.
I think it's a believe, right? Like, yeah. I mean, which I think is fair for where it is in the metagame, right? It's like, it's a deck that is like top 10-ish. It's number 12 on the Goldfish list. So, I mean, it's front page, baby. Like, so, it's like by grinding station and like 4 and 5 color Omnath in terms of like amount that it's seen by Goldfish. So, good on you, Domain Zoo, for getting your head above water and being a deck that has legitimate chops, I think, in the format.
Yeah.
Dave, we got through it. We did a long tournament breakdown and a shorter deck dive. So I'm impressed with us. Another week without Stan. We survived without the wind beneath our wings, the true wind in our sails, and I don't know, something else wind related. The blowhard?
I was going to say.
That's more me, I think. What's funny, Dave, is my wife asked me this week if you totaled up who talked the most on the podcast, who would it be? And I was like, I think we all try to talk rather evenly. And then I was like, it's probably me.
I think it actually might be me.
I think everyone just thinks they talk the most.
Yeah, too much. Too much. And with that in mind.
Yeah. That wraps up this week's show. If you have not yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. You get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, like we said earlier, feel free to leave us a rating, leave us a review. Let us know what you think about the Dive Down. If you want to submit a question, comment, reach out to us, you can tweet us at the Dive Down, all one word, email thedivedown@gmail.com. Get in those YouTube comments if you want to. We do post every episode on YouTube for those who can't really easily get at podcasts other ways. If you want to support the show, you can join the Patreon over at patreon.com/thedivedown. Check out our store at thedivedown.com/store as well to also help keep us going. Thanks again to Mana Traders for sponsoring the Dive Down. You can sign up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown15. No, it's the Dive Down 10 now. All one word for 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. You can also get some awesome shaving soaps, body soaps, fragrances, and more at Barrister and Mann, MANN, using code TheDiveDown15 for 15% off your first order. Again, you can save money on paper cards over at Nerd Rage Gaming with code DIVE8 for 8% off your order there. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and be the master of your domain.